Thank you all very much for your welcoming speeches. It is important to know the roots where we come from, and therefore we started commemorizing 101 years. But now Rector Bandaria in particular moved us into the issues of today, and this is what is the purpose of this conference. We are not here to remember and discuss the history. That will also be done in the afternoon in a panel. But we are here in particular to discuss the challenges of the present and the future, the challenges for the human right to quality education. And for that purpose, we have a very high-powered number of introductory keynote speakers, starting with Gillian Triggs, Assistant High Commissioner of Protection of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Gillian is an international lawyer who held many positions serving human rights and refugees, like, for example, also as the president of the Australian Human Rights Commission. However, in her present function, she is overseeing the whole protection work of UNHCR, dealing with refugees, asylum seekers, displaced persons, and also stateless persons. So I would like to thank her very much. She tried until the last moment to be here in person. Fortunately, this conference is a hybrid one, like many today. So this also allows me to welcome particularly our online participants. And it also allows persons like Gillian Triggs to be with us today. Also, she would otherwise be prevented from that. A warm welcome, and we are looking forward to what you have to tell us.
That warm welcome, and also for the very interesting introductory speeches. I am very sorry that I'm not with you in the ceremonial hall. It looks to be truly beautiful. And as a former law professor, I certainly have been both delighted to be part of a scholarly community through this conference, but also to have the opportunity to congratulate the World University Service for their 101 years of inspirational and dogged support for education globally, and of course to stand up for the critical principles of the right to education and to the importance of academic freedom. So thank you for allowing me to be part of this event. And on behalf of the UN's Refugee Agency, I would like in particular to emphasize the human right to quality education, which of course is the topic of this conference, but as it applies to some of the most vulnerable people globally, refugee children and youths. Education is not only a fundamental human right, but it's one of the most valuable assets a refugee can have. For refugee children, education is life-saving, offering protection and opportunities to meet their potential in the future. I was reminded of this when 3 years ago I visited Christmas Island, a detention centre for asylum seekers and refugees on an isolated and perhaps unfortunately named island in the Indian Ocean. I well remember meeting a 12-year-old girl there, bright-eyed and eager, who calmly told me how her family had been killed in the war and conflict in Sudan, and how she was able, with the support of an aunt, to make the dangerous journey to Asia, seeking protection. She remained quite composed and calm until she told me that she'd been held in detention on the island for over a year without access to any education. At this point, she burst into tears, for she understood that without access to schooling, her opportunities were fast disappearing. Well, in my hopefully brief remarks, I'd like to first look at some very troubling facts about the lack of access for education to so many asylum seekers and refugees, along with The law, and many of our speakers, introductory speakers, have mentioned human rights as a fundamental principle. And then to finish by looking at some of our UNHCR priorities and opportunities. But firstly then, can I say that, and putting this in context, the United Nations Refugee Agency reported this year that there are 82.4 million people forcibly displaced throughout the world. At least half of them are children, and 48% of those remain out of school. There are worrying inequalities for refugee children in access to education. And this year, the UN Refugee Agency's education report, called Staying the Course, found that more than 40 countries reporting said that 68% of refugee children have access to primary education, but only 34% to secondary education, and a mere 5%, if that, to tertiary education. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a documented learning crisis, the evidence being that 53% of children in low and middle income countries cannot read or understand a simple story by the end of primary school. The figure has increased to as much as 80% in low-income countries. And there are significant disparities in and among countries with respect to refugees. In Jordan, for example, which is one of the most generous of the refugee hosting countries, primary education for refugees stands at 59%, but for local children at 82%. It's of grave concern that 66% of refugee youth globally are not enrolled at all in secondary education, a gap that has an immense impact on their future, on peaceful and sustainable development, and on local economies. Such a waste of human potential. Gender inequality also remains a significant barrier to primary and secondary education in those countries hosting asylum seekers and refugees. Data from last year shows that while 35% of boys are educated at the secondary level, the corresponding figure for girls is 30%. We are, of course, deeply concerned by the situation in Afghanistan, where it may be that girls will have very limited access to at least secondary and tertiary education. The global pandemic has, of course, exacerbated inequalities. On average, refugee children in those countries reporting have lost 142 days of learning from the first school closure in March last year. It's feared, for example, that girls may never return in many countries as evidence grows of early pregnancies and labour and sexual exploitation. Well, those are some of the sad facts that are reflected in our report. But of course, underlying these facts is the aspirational and legal obligation of access to education for everyone, which of course is one of the key purposes of this meeting. I can begin, of course, with the 1951 Convention on Refugees, and we celebrate the 70th anniversary this year, where there is a commitment by now 148 countries globally to ensuring that all refugees and asylum seekers have access to at least primary education. We also have the Incheon Declaration and Framework for Action, which commits to developing more inclusive, responsive and resilient education systems to meet the needs of children, youths and adults in conflict-affected areas, including those who are internally displaced and refugees. We have the Sustainable Development Goal that we, of course, hope to meet by 2030 to ensure inclusive and equitable education for all. And we have the UNHCR's strategy for education for refugee children that emphasizes inclusion, quality, and equitable and sustainable educational outcomes. I'd like to mention, if I may, also the aspirational and I think inspirational document, the Global Compact on Refugees. It's not a legal obligation, but it is written in plain English, translatable, I hope, in plain languages other than English. But it's an easy read, that it describes a different approach to global solidarity and cooperation. It adopts a principle of global, equitable sharing of responsibility for people forcibly displaced and includes equitable access to education. And I know that one of the intended outcomes of this global conference is to agree on a Vienna Declaration on the human rights to quality education. And that draft is very encouraging. It references refugee children and youth and calls for renewed efforts to ensure a quality education, particularly at secondary and tertiary levels, and to ensure that the resources are available to ensure that to those vulnerable people, there is meaningful participation in the digital world. Well, what then are UNHCR's priorities for the future? The first is resources. We need to focus on resources that are available to particularly host countries to support refugees that they're so generously providing protection for, but also to consider how resources can be used more effectively for refugees. It's a sad reality that 90% of the world's refugees and internally displaced people are hosted by some of the poorest or developing countries in the world. The burden is clearly unequal, and schools in these countries are often seriously under-resourced. The second of our priorities is inclusion. It's become imperative that we ensure that all children are included in the education, particularly for refugee children in host countries. Until recently, only 42% of refugee children from Venezuela, who are now living in Colombia, were enrolled in primary school. But the very good news, and an example of world best practice, is the recent decision of the Colombian government to grant temporary protection status to about 1.7 million Venezuelan refugees and their children, giving them access to jobs, to identification documents, to COVID vaccinations, and for the purposes, of course, of this conference, to education. But also, we would like to see greater monitoring of accredited educational programs so that we can ensure that children have a quality curriculum all the way through primary and secondary school, leading to recognized qualifications, which can be then their springboard to university and higher vocational training. Well, there are, of course, significant remaining barriers to education for all. Birth and school credentials for stateless people, for refugees and asylum-seeking children, and a lack of systems for recognizing qualifications in host countries. There have, during the COVID pandemic, been some opportunities, one being the use of digital technologies, of remote learning technologies, which have provided an opportunity for stateless people, internally displaced people, to have access in remote communities to education through the internet. And there are very creative solutions being offered, one by Colibri, a free supplement to classroom education, developed by a group called Learning Equality in the Zatari refugee camp in Jordan, which uses the server when available, but then enables other devices and local networks to be able to provide education. I've mentioned that girls faced very particular barriers to accessing secondary education and tertiary education, and we need, we think, to adopt targeted measures to increase the number of female teachers, for cash subsidies to support school retentions, and appropriate and safe infrastructure. Children with disabilities, also very high amongst refugee and displaced communities, need special measures to ensure their retention and completion. But finally then, of course, numbers, data don't always tell the story. The real question is not only access to that education, but how we ensure quality education. And we believe that some of the notions of monitoring and resource application and support to host governments will be critical measures to ensure that quality. I've mentioned that to include children and youths from refugee families can place a major strain on hosting communities and on governments. And that's why a critical element is financial support to government. We're seeing that in some countries, progress being made in Uganda, in Turkey, in Kenya, but we need to maintain that global compact vision of shared responsibilities to ensure pathways to solutions. So thank you very much for including me today. I very much look forward to the discussion and to the successful conclusion of a Vienna Declaration on access to quality education. Thank you all.
Let me thank Gillian Triggs for this very rich account of the issue of refugee education in general and the many particular challenges related to it. I personally had the opportunity to get a glance of this problem when I visited the island of Lesbos and the camp Karatepe II this July, and I found that in this camp there is no facility whatsoever for the education of children. Children which, as Doctors Without Borders tell us, are increasingly re-traumatized by waiting there for months and partly years for a decision on their future. Some of them are now taken out of the camp to have at least something outside, also with the help of Austrian NGOs, but without the NGOs nothing would be foreseen for them. And this raises certainly the issue what the respective government, but also the European Union, which is supporting this camp, are thinking about the issue of the human right to education.